Two candidates, two different policy positions. We've got the records and the facts. We've sorted through all the mess and propaganda. Let's talk about Harris, Trump, and the economy. Kamala Harris was asked, are Americans better off now than they were 4 years ago? She doesn't answer the question. And we'll talk about why in a moment. But let's see what she said.
So I was raised as a middle-class kid. And I am actually the only person on this stage who has a plan that is about lifting up the middle class and working people of America. I believe in the ambition, the aspirations, the dreams of the American people. And that is why I imagine and have actually a plan to build what I call an opportunity economy. Because here's the thing. We know that we have a shortage of homes and housing. And the cost of housing is too expensive for far too many people. We know that young families need support to raise their children, and I intend on extending a tax cut for those families of $6,000, which is the largest child tax credit that we have given in a long time, so that those young families can afford to buy a crib, buy a car seat, buy clothes for their children. My plan is to give a $50,000 tax deduction to startup small businesses, knowing they are part of the backbone of America's economy. My opponent, on the other hand, his plan is to do what he has done before.
Since she didn't answer the question, we will. No, Americans are not better off than they were 4 years ago, 6 years ago. This is where we need to talk about inflation, which is easily understandable. Inflation is the measurement of price changes. When costs go up, you'll see the inflation number higher. When costs go down, you'll see a lower inflation percentage. There's something called the Consumer Price Index, or the Consumer Pricing Index, which simply tracks the price of a standard basket of goods, they call it, which are the goods and services that we use every day or every week as Americans. We're talking about housing, rent, transportation like cars and gasoline, food like groceries and dining, healthcare like medicine, insurance or going to the doctor, clothing, education, communication like your phone bill, recreation like entertainment, music, etc. And there's more categories, but you get the idea. It's the measuring of the price of the things that everyday people want or need every day or every week. So inflation is the rise in prices over time, and CPI is the indicator of how much prices have increased relative to a base year. What is the standard rate of inflation? It's about 2%. And without getting too complicated, the base year is somewhere around 1982. So the inflation rate is saying the average cost of things is blank percent higher than it was in 1982 or 1984. If you go back and look at the numbers for January 2017 to now, September 2024, President Trump's average inflation rate was 1.9%, while President Biden, with VP Harris, have an average inflation rate of 4.9%. In other words, the costs of everyday items are more than double what they were when Trump was in office. Here's what Forbes said about Bidenflation. Inflation has been far worse during the Biden administration, up 19% over the first 42 months of Biden's term, compared to 6% during Trump's first 42 months. According to the government's Consumer Price Index, year over year, inflation peaked under Biden at a 4-decade high of 9% in 2022 before falling to just over 3%, which Biden has blamed on COVID-19's lingering impact and the Russia-Ukraine war. Now, Forbes doesn't present the whole truth here. Does COVID have a lingering impact on the economy? Yes, because many states were too heavy-handed in the shutdowns, causing millions to lose their jobs and their small businesses, and we'll come back to jobs in a moment. Does the Ukrainian conflict have a sizable impact on our economy? Well, compared to other things, no, not so much. But so far, the U.S. has spent $175 billion on that war. So what is the cause of Bidenflation, for which Kamala Harris was wingwoman? Why did inflation reach a 40-year high in 2022? If you listen to the show, you already know the answer. What is the United States' most important product? Petroleum. Why? Because it's connected to everything. Everything. Go back and listen to episode 40. It's called The Emperor Has No Clothes, where we did a deep dive on this. But when Biden and Harris came into office, on their first day, they revoked the permit for the Keystone XL pipeline, which would have transported oil in the most environmentally friendly process easier from Canada to the United States. They suspended new oil and gas leases on federal lands and waters where crude oil and fossil fuels are extracted from the earth. Their administration delayed permits for other entry infrastructure and pipelines. This all led to draining our strategic petroleum reserves, which Trump had replenished before he left office, potentially compromising emergency energy and national security. They begged foreign countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Venezuela for their oil or more oil. They have constantly repeated the refrain, "No more drilling," and they rejoined the United States to the Paris Climate Accords, which signals to the petroleum industry that more regulations are coming. All of it, was during the very beginning of the Biden-Harris administration. When gas prices were at their worst ever, the highest gas prices ever, it was summer of 2022, which is when Bidenflation peaked at close to 9%. The average price of a gallon of gas was just over $5. That's an all-time record. So it's not just happenstance that under President Trump, your gasoline was around $2 a gallon, and under Biden-Harris's terrible economic and environmental policy, the cost of everything doubled. It's supply and demand and cost of production. When supply is low and demand is high and it costs more to produce, inflation skyrockets. And that, my friends, is why there is a direct connection between Biden's regulations and revocations and the immediate rise in fuel costs, which then dominoes to everything else. That's why inflation was at its highest in recent history when gas was the highest it's ever been. Don't miss the point here, though. The majority of the economic woes under Biden and Harris was their economic policy, their energy policy, and other policies that we'll get to later. Policy is everything. It doesn't matter how friendly and nice and happy someone is if their policies suck. According to Investopedia, the worst unemployment rate ever was in 1933, when 24.9% of Americans were jobless from the Great Depression. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the U.S. Department of Labor, the unemployment rate in 2020 was 6.7%, which was 11 million Americans without work. Listen, COVID hit in the spring of 2020. But take a look at this chart. Unemployment dropped to 3.5% in February of 2020, which was a 50-year low. It had not been that low since December 1969. And then COVID hit. That's the large spike you see in April of 2020 when unemployment surged to 14.8%. Kamala Harris and the Democrats want to soil Trump's impeccable jobs numbers by focusing attention on the pandemic job loss, saying that it's his fault and he gave us the worst economy and job situation. That's what we inherited.
Donald Trump left us the worst unemployment since the Great Depression.
There's a few problems here. First of all, there is only a kernel of truth in her claim, but it's mostly misleading. The significant job loss from the pandemic, as I've already alluded, is falsely attributed to Donald Trump because just as he's done with the issue of abortion, he left decisions to the states. And in many states, they allowed their counties to make their own decisions about safety measures and protocols and how long they would have shutdowns, etc. He didn't want to be a dictator that everyone on the far left makes him out to be, so he let governors decide and mayors decide how to run their states and their counties. The significant job loss is due to the extensive lockdown measures and shutdowns, which costs millions of people their jobs and their businesses. Just ask Minnesotans how they feel about Tim Walz's leadership in 2020. Secondly, prior to COVID, Trump's economy was very, very good, and unemployment was at a 50-year low. COVID hit and the lockdowns happened. That's when unemployment spiked to 14.8%. However, by the time Trump left office and Biden and Harris took the reins, unemployment dropped to 6.4%. Now, if we take a look at that chart again, you can see that unemployment since about September of 2022 has been rising for 2 years. The current unemployment rate is 4.2%, which is over 7 million Americans without work. Forbes reports, much of the Biden labor market gains are part of the post-pandemic recovery, as unemployment was just 3.5% in February 2020, and the number of employed Americans is up only 4%. Biden has largely focused on the COVID-skewed data points, and Trump's labor market performance depends strictly on the cutoff date, as the COVID-19 disruption undid much of the nominal progress, sending unemployment briefly to an all-time high of 14.9% in April 2020. Trump's way of putting this is that Biden and Harris have enjoyed reporting what he calls bounce-back jobs, or jobs that are a natural occurrence in the aftermath of a global pandemic. And he's right. Earlier this year, I reported to you that most of the Biden-Harris job growth is from Americans leaving states like New York and California, moving to a different state like Texas or Florida and getting a job there. So literally, any job counts to them as job growth. Well, it turns out they've been misleading the public on their job reporting. CNN reported in August, the Bureau of Labor Statistics preliminary annual benchmark review of employment data suggests that there were 818,000 fewer jobs in March of this year than were initially reported. The beautiful thing about this election is that we know both of the candidates very well. There's no secret to either of them. Yes, Donald Trump is relatively new to politics, but the man was president for 4 years. He lost his re-election in 2020, and here he is once again as the Republican nominee. Kamala Harris has been in politics for 2 decades. She became a district attorney in 2004, an attorney general in 2011, a senator in 2017, and the vice president in 2021. We know exactly who she is, and I've talked about both of their records extensively on this show. But Kamala Harris thinks that you'll forget that fact. She thinks that you won't remember that Trump has already been the president. So when Trump is asked about his economic policy and he signals a return to Trumpian policy, Kamala Harris gaslights the voter and says stuff like this.
Donald Trump has no plan for you. And when you look at his economic plan, it's all about tax breaks for the richest people. I am offering what I describe as an opportunity economy, and the best economists in our country, if not the world, have reviewed our relative plans for the future of America. What Goldman Sachs has said is that Donald Trump's plan would make the economy worse, mine would strengthen the economy.
One of the best ways you can help our show, other than by sharing today's content, is by picking up some We the Free merch at WeTheFreeShow.com. You can be the Salt and Light you were meant to be by wearing the Salt and Light shirt or by sipping your coffee from the Salt and Light mug, or you can sport the God Bless America shirt and the We the Free crest tee. We've got stickers and a Smells Like Freedom candle, so check out our merch today at WeTheFreeShow.com. Donald Trump has no plan for you, she says, just minutes after saying that Donald Trump has a plan for you, and it's called Project 2025, which for the 1000th time, he has literally nothing to do with. He's disavowed it. I've actually read it, and trust me, his positions do not align with the conservative think tank's positions. She says Donald Trump has no plan for you, and then says Donald Trump's economic plans are tax cuts for the richest people. Now, just remember, we have all the records from Trump's first term, and we have all the records from the Biden-Harris term. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 cuts the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%. That helped American businesses compete internationally and gave them more money to pay their employees, which are mostly middle-class Americans, and to invest more in their products. American companies would also only be taxed on their domestic income instead of their worldwide earnings. Over 6 million American workers, received wage increases and bonuses and increased benefits as well. Individually, each tax bracket was lowered at varying rates. The child tax credit was doubled, and the average family of four earning $75,000 a year received an income tax cut of more than $2,000, which cut their tax bill in half. That's what Donald Trump did. That's why you have retained those tax codes. That's right. If they were so bad, you would have gotten rid of them. And that's what he will do again if reelected. She can argue and say, well, the experts say that my plan is better, but we have the unique opportunity to look at the last 8 years and compare the numbers. The Biden-Harris economy has been significantly worse than the Trump economy, and that's a fact. However, Kamala has, once again, presented a kernel of truth. The Goldman Sachs CEO, David Solomon, has downplayed Kamala's remarks there because the difference between Trump's plans and Kamala's so-called plans is quite minuscule. He said the difference was 0.2%, and that's because of one thing, one humongous thing, the federal deficit, or what we can call spending. Trump's economic numbers would have been even better had he not spent so much money during the pandemic. But he was spending money on a medical emergency and in stimulating the economy and R&D for vaccines and therapeutics. The Biden-Harris administration has done the same thing, just not on a pandemic. They have spent lots of money on bloated bills with oxymoronic names like the Inflation Reduction Act, which added nearly $1 trillion to the debt. It didn't reduce anything. And Kamala's plan includes lots more government spending, like a whole lot more. The only policies she's actually mentioned have to do with handouts or the government spending more money, our money, just giving out money. They also want to raise taxes across the board. And when the government spends too much money and overtaxes, the economy inevitably suffers. Now, Trump did several things to offset the federal government's loss in revenue to tax cuts, but one of those things was the implementation of strong tariffs, which is a tax on foreign imports. Again, Donald Trump did this when he was president. We were all there. We all saw it, and we saw the economic success. But again, the Democrats think we're stupid and forgetful, so they push this narrative.
Do you believe Americans can afford higher prices because of tariffs?
They're not going to have higher prices. What's going to have and who's going to have higher prices is China and all of the countries that have been ripping us off for years. I was the only president ever China was paying us hundreds of billions of dollars, and so were other countries. And, you know, if she doesn't like them, they should have gone out and they should have immediately cut the tariffs. But those tariffs are there 3.5 years now under their administration.
Two important points here. First, tariffs are used to create economic leverage with a competing nation in the business of trade. We've been in a trade war with China for years. Trump is right when he says that China has been ripping us off for years. The United States has been importing Chinese products far more than China has imported American products. In 2018, the trade deficit with China was over $419 billion, as in America spent over $419 billion more dollars than what China spent on American products. So what did President Trump do? He imposed tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods, all in an effort to protect American jobs and industries and workers. Why does this work? China has to pay more to import their products into the United States. That means that Chinese companies will either have to raise their prices or stop selling to the US, which they won't do because the United States is a pivotal market. They need us. So they're forced to take their cheap crap and make it more expensive. Well, what happens here? Americans go, well, we can do better than this. And Americans start buying American-made products instead of Chinese products. Does that make sense? And Trump's hopes are that China caves to the pressure and buys more American products, which would be wonderful for Americans and the United States. This is also why Trump pointed out that Biden and Harris kept a number of these Trump tariffs intact. The moderators asked her about this, and she didn't answer. Speaking of exporting, the main reason that Donald Trump's economy was so much better than Biden and Harris's economy is because Trump's administration unleashed the petroleum industry to the point of the United States becoming a net oil exporter for the first time in 75 years. At one point during his term, the United States became the #1 producer of oil and natural gas in the world. A large part of the energy boom was due to the untethering of hydraulic fracturing, which goes by a different name, fracking. Fracking is a revolutionary process of much more easily extracting natural gas and oil from the earth, which could not have been obtained through traditional means. It's the use of hydraulic pressure to push the materials from the earth beneath us. But the controversy relates to its environmental impact. For one, it makes it easier to obtain oil and natural gas, the things that contribute to the purported destruction of the planet, and it must be stopped. But critics say it contaminates water and causes earthquakes and allows for greenhouse emissions. This is why Kamala Harris said this when she was running for president in 2019.
My family lives in western Pennsylvania, where fracked gas wells have become a common sight, yet the toxic impacts of fracking on the community are immense, from contaminated groundwater to poisonous emissions. Will you commit to implementing a federal ban on fracking your first day in office, adding the United States to the list of countries who have banned this devastating practice?
There's no question I'm in favor of banning fracking. So, yeah, and starting with what we can do on day one around public lands, right? And then there has to be legislation. But yes, and this is something I've taken on in California. I have a history of working on this issue. And to your point, we have to just acknowledge that the residual impact of fracking is enormous in terms of the impact on the health and safety of communities. Yeah, so thank you.
So would you ban offshore drilling?
Yes, and I've, again, worked on that.
There's no question I'm in favor of banning fracking. So you remember that gas prices reached an all-time record high in the summer of 2022, and inflation reached almost 9% at that same time. Well, in August of 2022, Congress passed the Inflation Reduction Act by the tie-breaking vote of Vice President Harris. The legislation supports the expansion of oil and gas leases on federal lands, which would include fracking. But at the same time, the act aims to regulate and reduce the environmental impact of fossil fuel production, which includes stricter methane regulations, as in companies can face federal penalties. So it's odd that they incorporated such provisions into the act right after record gas prices, the highest inflation in decades, and after such a strong stance against anything having to do with petroleum in the United States. There was a flip in policy. In fact, there are a number of policies which Kamala Harris has supposedly flipped on: gun rights, the border, electric vehicle mandates, plastics, policing, universal health care, etc. She was asked about this by Lindsay Davis. The question is, why have so many of your policy positions changed? This is what she says.
My values have not changed, and I'm going to discuss every one of at least every point that you've made. But in particular, let's talk about fracking because we're here in Pennsylvania. I made that very clear in 2020. I will not ban fracking. I have not banned fracking as Vice President of the United States. And in fact, I was the tie-breaking vote on the Inflation Reduction Act, which opened new leases for fracking.
Values are not the same as policies. She dodged the question, and the moderators didn't press her for an answer. She only mentions fracking. She lies at first to make it seem like she didn't oppose fracking in the last election. I just played you the clip. She most definitely did, and Trump's face says it all. To finish off with economic policy, here's Howard Lutnick on CNBC.
There's only one way to break inflation, okay? And that is to bring down energy costs. The only tool that you really have to break inflation is to bring down, you have to stop printing money. God knows you have to stop printing money because we all know where inflation comes from, right? Inflation comes from the American Rescue Plan, which was passed in 2021, which created $2 trillion of new cash being produced, right? That came into the economy. Everyone said it's going to create inflation. It created inflation in the middle of 2022. Okay, so we all know where inflation came from. It's called the American Rescue Plan. $2 trillion of spending. Look, you can't produce inflation without printing money. If you don't print money, you can't produce inflation.
Thanks for watching today. Listen, I want to make sure that you stay informed on the news and the biblical response to it. So do yourself and us a favor and hit the subscribe button before you go. And then we would love for you to check out WeTheFreeShow.com to grab yourself some merch to spread the word about We The Free. And we're also going to put a video on the screen right now that we think you'll like. Now, go and be that salt and light, and we'll see you next time.